Hey writers, you're listening to the Kobo Writing Life podcast, where we bring you insights and inspiration for growing your self-publishing business. We're your hosts. I'm Rachel, one of Kobo Writing Life's author engagement managers.
And I'm Laura, Kobo Writing Life's other author engagement manager.
On today's episode, we had the pleasure of speaking to #1 New York Times and USA Today best-selling author Jennifer L. Armentrout. Jennifer lives in West Virginia, and when she's not hard at work writing, she spends a lot of her time reading, working out, watching zombie movies, and pretending to write. Her dreams of becoming an author started in algebra class, where she spent her time writing short stories, therefore explaining her dismal grades in math. Jennifer writes young adult, contemporary, urban fantasy, paranormal, and romance.
We talked to Jennifer about her indie publishing journey, the mega success of her Blood and Ash series, how she handled going extremely viral on TikTok, and we also chatted about her tips for writing a long-running series and her experience as a hybrid author, including what she thinks the traditional publishing business could learn from indie authors. It was a great talk, full of lots of insights from someone who's been in the industry for such a long time, and we think you'll really enjoy.
All right. Hello, everybody. Today we are joined by best-selling author Jennifer L. Armentrout. Jennifer, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us today.
Thank you guys so much for having me.
Now, I know you've been on this podcast before, but for those who are unfamiliar, could you kind of kick things off by telling our listeners a little bit about yourself?
I am the author of multiple genre books. I've written a little bit, I think 70 books, I think. And I mostly write romance, but in different subgenres. So I've written in fantasy, contemporary, paranormal, mystery, suspense / horror. So I write across the board different genres, but all of them have a strong element of romance in them.
And can you tell us a little bit about how your writing journey began?
You know, as cheesy as it sounds, I've always wanted to be a writer for a very long time. It really started when I read my first book when I was a teenager that made me cry. And the reason why that kind of like sparked my love of writing is because I could not understand why I was so emotionally invested in something I knew wasn't real. And so and then to realize my God, that reading can provide you with such a huge escape that you can be completely transported to a different world, or people that aren't real, and you can have those emotions. And then I realized that not only is reading like an escape, the writing itself acts like it. So I wrote my first book when I was in 9th grade algebra class. I do not recommend. I did end up in, oh my gosh, what's that called in college? Remedial math is what they call it in college. So because of that, but I didn't start writing seriously until the late 2000s, and mainly because I understood that writing wasn't what I went to college for, and it's hard to do. It's hard to stick with it. It's hard to, if you want to make a career out of it. So when I started to do it seriously, it took several years for me to work up the nerve to submit it to agents and publishers. But I did, I believe, in 2009 or 2010, and my first book deal was with a small press. So I got started in a very non-confirmative way at that time. It is insane how much publishing has changed in the last 14, 15 years. When I started, self-publishing was not seen as a viable option. Small press publishers or independent publishers were not seen as good publishers. And so I got started in young adult, which is even harder and still is hard without a traditional publisher, because obviously you have to have your books usually in a bookstore for teenagers to be able to purchase. But I kind of started off in that non-traditional way of going with a small press publisher. And I really attribute my career starting, honestly, with that book to the bloggers of that time. So this is before TikTok, before Instagram. There were book bloggers, and they got behind this book. And without their support and them sharing it, doing reviews, they used to do these YA book boyfriend tournaments. So it was like March Madness, and they would have brackets and everything. And without them, I would not be sitting here today, 14 years later. So, I mean, I owe almost everything to the book bloggers of that time. But my career started that way. And then I went traditional, and I still go back and forth between small press and traditional.
I love that the passion of your readers has been such a driving force throughout your career. I find that so fascinating and incredible that you've had such, I don't know, outspoken fans throughout your career to keep you, I don't know, boosted. It's amazing. I'm really curious about your publishing journey, though, because like you mentioned, you started with a small press, you've gone back traditional, you kind of live in that hybrid space. I'm curious what you think that the traditional publishing world could learn from the indie space and the small press space, and kind of vice versa.
That's a loaded question that I feel like you would need a whole podcast series to answer. I think honestly, the biggest thing I think traditional publishers could learn is being able to adapt better and more quickly to things that change. It's almost like things that traditional publishers, and I still have active contracts with them, but and they know I feel this way. So but I feel like they're stuck in the way it was. And we do it this way because that's the way it's always been done, even if that way really isn't working as much anymore. And when they try something new and it doesn't work immediately, it's just dropped. And part of the reason for that, obviously, is there's a lot of overhead costs that bigger publishers have that smaller publishers do not have. And so on that extent, I do understand that. But I feel like for them, that still leaves room for there to be changes. And I feel like if you look at some of the most popular books right now, at least in genre fiction, right, they're not from big publishers. They're mostly from small press publishers or indie. And that's not to say that there are not popular romance, fantasy, contemporary books that come out from, traditional. There's obviously Emily Henry and Anna Huang. I'm sorry if I pronounced the last name wrong. I mean, there is many of them, but a lot of them are coming from smaller publishers. And I think the main reason is about, time has no meaning now, I feel like. But I would say about probably 4 to 5 years ago. Actually, it'd be longer than that. It's 2024, dear God. So I would say probably around 2016. I'm sure you guys may have started to notice something. Traditional publishers were publishing less romance. And during that time, they were pulling back on the romance. They were cutting out what they call their mid-list authors. And mid-list authors are the bread and butter of publishers. They may not sell a quadrillion books, but every book they sell a certain amount that those publishers can count on. They keep the lights on. And what was happening is traditional publishers really could not compete with the ebook prices that indie and small press publishers were setting. And instead of changing their price model, they, in a way, admitted defeat and just let go of so many romance authors that are now indie publishing or with small presses. And I feel like there wasn't a long-term strategy there. There wasn't foresight that there has to be another way. And that possibly could be how you do publishing, the timelines, the turnarounds. But at the same time, they started making large cuts in their departments. Editors are editing 2 to 3 times more now, authors, than they ever were. So it's, obviously I can sit here and say they could do this and that, but I don't, I'm not working there. So, but I feel like, at least in my opinion, that's where you started to see this disconnect between what the industry was wanting and then what they provide. And I mean, I think that's something you probably always seen in publishing in general, where they try to shape what readers want. And sometimes that works. And there are times that it really doesn't. And beforehand, it didn't matter if it didn't work, right? Because there was no really other viable way to get books into readers' hands. And when Book Talk took off, that pretty much blew the gate off of that because there was really no longer truly any gatekeepers in place that could steer the market one way or the other. And I feel like, that's kind of when you also started to see that there's going to have to be some changes here for, them to still be able to publish effectively.
Yeah, I agree. I think Book Talk kind of gave indie authors that advantage because they're able to jump on those ideas so quickly, whereas publishers need so much time to make a book happen. And sometimes by the time that gets published, they're behind on the
Yeah.
trend. So,
Well, and it's like, so in the past, I feel like there was a lot of chasing a trend and being able to also set that trend. And then once a trend happens, they throw 500 million versions of that against the wall. Three more of those will stick. And I mean, and that's kind of how it was. But as you said, like with Book Talk, it's so fast and nothing beats word of mouth. Like at the end of the day, even now, as publishers and authors have tried to use TikTok in the way that like Facebook advertising and other online advertising is done, it still is mostly word of mouth. Like it, because you can always tell when a post is sponsored. Beside the fact that I'm saying it's a sponsored post, but also you can just tell. And another thing that just popped to me that happened roughly around the same, I think it was a perfect storm. It was Book Talk. It was the pandemic. It was like them kind of cutting out the romance, but also something else pretty major happened. And that was Barnes and Noble and Waterstones. And in the US, especially Waterstones, I believe, took over Barnes and Noble, and the way they brought books in changed. Beforehand, it was mostly like a national buyer in a way that controlled. It was extremely hard for small press books to get into Barnes and Noble and almost impossible for indie books. And then with Waterstones allowed it to be more of a regional and store by store basis. So the people who worked there were able to say, this book, I know it's not with this publisher, but this is huge online. We need to get these books in. And that, I think it was like that perfect storm of all those things happening at one time that, kind of has shaped the way publishing is right now.
And I also think, just to kind of like jump on all of this, I also think that one really cool thing that Book Talk especially has done was give romance readers especially more of a voice and allow themselves to be seen as serious readers, because it's, for the longest time, romance readers are the most voracious readers in publishing. That's no secret. But now with the explosion of indie publishing, there's enough content to keep up with that voracious readership, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah, and I think out of all the readers that are out there, romance readers are the most likely to cross genres, where people who are more into literary fiction or historical fiction don't necessarily fall into that crossover. And every publisher and everybody in publishing wants a crossover, quote unquote, success, because you're breaking that bubble, those boundaries with that. And romance readers are almost always the ones kind of responsible for those huge breakout books, because they will jump from genre to genre to genre. And where you don't necessarily see that in a lot of the other fiction groups.
Do you think, and sorry if this is also another loaded question, but do you think that one of the reasons why romance readers, or let me flip this, why the readers of, let's say, literary fiction don't cross genres is because they have a preconceived notion of, I don't want to say like snobbiness, because I don't think that's the right word, but just like they have a different mindset about reading and content in general?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people who are very opinionated about romance likely have never picked up a romance book in the last like 20 years. Because when you listen to them talk, you're like, was the 80s the last time you read a romance book? Like, or when they talk about covers and you're like, yeah, the covers haven't looked like that in a very long time. And so, I mean, I think it's preconceived notion. I think it is like, I think it also comes with that preconceived notion. It comes down to a lot of times that romance is something that is dominated mostly by women, and anything that has to do with women or girls is often seen as less than, not as serious as fluff. And people, I think it's the most interesting thing, though, is when you have someone who's never read romance before, but ends up hearing about a book that, like, I can look at like the Blood and Ash series of mine, for example, or I'll say, for example, even something like Fourth Wing. When you look at those covers, you don't see romance. You read that synopsis, you may see a hint of romance in there, but not really. You have no idea that you're actually reading a romance book. It's a romantic fantasy. Romance is the main plot of the story, like, at the end of the day. But one thing that romance does is that the other plots, right, the fantasy elements of it are on equal footing as the romance. So it's, the plots are moving at the same time. So I think that the coolest thing with that, when people don't kind of realize they're reading it, and then they do, and then they're like, oh, like, this is not what I thought. So I do think, even though there is a lot of preconceived notion, I think what you're definitely seeing with fantasy romance is people reading romance for the first time. And then they're going on and reading other romance books. And then they're venturing into contemporary and then into other genres, because they're realizing, oh, romance it's just another element of the story. Like, but there's still so much happening in those books. And, I think also a lot has to do with that too, is just cover trends, like covers going away from having the people on the cover and becoming like more of what I think they call like icon covers, or like where it's like an image, like a graphic or something on the cover. And that kind of lures people in. They don't realize what they're getting, kind of, in a way.
Yeah, that's such a good point about covers, because I think sometimes people get overwhelmed jumping into the romance genre when it's just maybe one of those like torso-y covers. It's like,
Yeah.
ooh, I'm not sure, but like the icon ones are more approachable for someone who's looking for like a more subtle entrance into
Yeah.
romance.
Yeah, and I think too, it's like I think, yeah, and I think also it just I sometimes I think that even though you would think that doesn't represent the story better, but in a way it does, because you're not getting caught up in one aspect of that story. And I think that's when people are a little standoffish about romance, is kind of what they need to take that extra like little push to start reading it.
Sure. And you've been writing fantasy romance for a while, even since before, like, we all kind of knew it as romantasy, as
Right.
it's been
When it was just
trending now.
romance with fantasy elements, or
For sure.
fancy romantic elements in it.
Yeah. What kind of drew you to the genre specifically?
So, and I am so glad you guys, just first off, are acknowledging that romantic fantasy, or however you pronounce that, is not new. This is not anything new. The only newer part of it, I would say, is the inclusion of more high fantasy in that genre, because high fantasy has never been really kind to any women in the stories, and love was not a good thing. But you also saw it in what they used to call back in the day urban fantasy. And reason why they called it that, it was fantasy that took place in the contemporary world. I don't even know what they call it now, but fantasy has always been a draw to me, because it's a true escape. Like, even if you are writing like what I just call contemporary fantasy, which is like in our real world, you're dealing with things that don't exist. So it's easier for you to kind of forget your problems, or even if you don't have problems, just to kind of wind down and just not think about life in general. And especially when you get into high fantasy, it's even more so an escape, because you're in a world that does not exist. And that has been what always has drawn me to reading it and to writing it, because you really can just be transported into worlds that you can actually see in your head. Like, they become so believable that, yeah, this has, dragons, shapeshifters, fae, whatever, but I believe it because it becomes so believable to you. And that has always been the huge lore to me.
And I'm so curious, just talking about like creating that perfect escape, and the fact that you write across many genres within the literary canon, if you will. I'm curious what your writing process looks like. Do you sit down with an idea first, with a world first? How do these books come to you?
So typically the character kind of comes to me first. Like, I'll come up with an idea of a character, but I would say, like, at the same time a character comes to me, the world starts to come at the same time. Because at least for me, when I build a character, I'm building it in the term of that world. whether it's a contemporary setting or high fantasy. So I kind of get like a basic idea of how the book starts, the first book, whether it's a series or not at this point doesn't matter. It's that first book, right? Then it kind of comes, okay, this is like the plot, like the overall, like what's the stakes here? Like, other than the romance, why care, kind of. And once I figure that out, I don't really think any more forward than that. I start writing because the story, as I write, ends up, coming to me as I write. That doesn't mean that I don't have any guideline in my head, because I often will know at that point how I want the book to end. But everything between point A and point Z often comes to me with me having a general idea of where the middle of that book should be. I don't outline, other than once I'm usually about at the 50% mark, I will start outlining that's not even 50%. I would say the last 25%, because that's where it's like the book can get away from you. And you're like, oh crap, I still have all this stuff that I have to cover, and I'm at 200,000 words. So that's when I outline, but I kind of let the story tell itself as I'm writing. Fantasy is different in some extent because you're creating a world at the same time. And so I feel like in fantasy, a world is a character within itself because you're having to create it from the ground up. It needs to be believable. You can write any world. You just have to establish like rules, and then you have to stick to those rules. And so a lot in fantasy is figuring out how to introduce new readers to the world, and also reminding existing readers, once you get 4 and 5 books in, certain things that even I forget. And so it's like you have to figure out a way to work that in to the book in a way that makes sense. So that's where you start to get into more of the technical side of, as you're moving the plot forward, moving the relationship forward, it's also reestablishing the world for readers.
And how, like you mentioned that you kind of let the story come to you as you're writing. Does the same thing happen with the world that you're creating?
I would say, so it took me a long time to write the Blood and Ash world, which the Flesh and Fire world spawns out of or spins out of. And I sat and tinkered with that idea for 3 years, mainly because I had like performance anxiety because I hadn't written a high fantasy before. And that's we said, that's a different beast. That's, you're creating an entire world that often will have own languages. I mean, things that you don't even think about, like communication. Like every time I see people use, and I know we use like birds and stuff to communicate, I don't understand how that works. We actually got people from point A to point, like messages, things like, but you have to figure out, right? Even down to like clothing, like, or how homes are built and what they're built of. And, and so you have to do all that. And so that was something I kind of tinkered around with many years before I started writing. But I finally got the idea of the world. But as I wrote the book, certain small things started to change because I realized, okay, this doesn't make sense. Or I don't need to be so exact in this because this is something that could easily change or become a problem in another book where I've written myself into a hole, basically. But I think with that world, it was a little different because I was tinkering with it so much beforehand, but it still changed.
And I'm really curious because I find world building fascinating. I'm a fantasy reader. I love escaping into a world that has like never existed before. Do you have a world Bible in which you keep all of this information?
Yes. So there is a massive Bible, and it's actually been converted into a compendium that I think was released. I don't know if it was this year or last year, Visions. And yes. And because look, we don't remember everything. Like I feel like, I mean, there may be authors who do. And if so, I'm jealous. And what do you do to remember everything? I would like to learn. Not only do we not remember everything, our editors don't. And if you ever have a change in editor or a copy editor, they have to get caught up. But not only do they have to get caught up in the previous books, they got to understand the world. And being caught up and understanding are two different things. Yes. So in this series and in some, some of my other series have them too. The editors start them, but they are always almost created by the editor. And it's mostly a guideline for them. And yeah, it's massive. It is so massive. Like it is in a Dropbox file. And they've even shared it as a OneDrive file, I think, at one time, or OneNote, to try to make it easier to search for certain things, because there's so many files, so many subfiles, and it's broken down by like kingdoms and everything. And it will have very intricate stuff in there, like details that maybe even haven't been revealed yet, but they know it's coming from, because they know what I'm doing. And then it'll have even simple things like a character's hair color, their skin tone, their eye color, because there's, even certain things like what type of hair do they have? You sometimes forget because you're like, crap, or you second guess yourself, and then you have to go back and look for it. But yes, it is a massive Bible. And what was put into Visions, I feel like was only like a little teeny bit of it, than to actually see the massive Bible.
And when you were creating Visions, was it kind of all information you had already, or did it kind of give you time to expand the world a little bit more as you were creating it?
It gave us, that was written between me and Raven, who also is one of the editors on the series. And it really actually gave us a chance to expand little bits of it. And, a lot of the readers wanted Miss Willa's diary. And Miss Willa's diary in the book is a ongoing bit, basically. In the series, it is basically a sex diary. And Poppy had the diary, and the male lead had found her with it and was like, it's just become a thing. And when I would write the diary entries, I would write it in the very old school 80s historical way of like, that type of prose where you're like, why are we calling body parts this type of prose? And I have so much fun doing it, because it's just like, and I'm not saying that prose is ridiculous. I make it even more ridiculous. And, but people have been wanting her book, and I've been like, I can't write that, because it would just be sex, 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 sex. And it becomes a point where it's like, I can only write so many sex scenes. Like at some point where I'm like, okay, this is, I can't do it. But it gave us the opportunity to put some in there. And so, but also there's bonus scenes in there that hadn't been seen before. And then fun things. So it did give us the opportunity to add new stuff, but we also had to be careful, because when you're not a strict plotter like I am, one little detail that you harmlessly put into something becomes like the thing that holds everything together without you even realizing it. So we had to be kind of very careful with that. But yeah, some of the diary entries did have hints in them. Like there were little Easter eggs in them, and stuff like that. So it was fun kind of dropping them in there.
You've kind of touched on your editor a few times, and I'm really curious, as somebody who has worked in different facets of the publishing industry, kind of what the revision process is like for you, especially because you now are currently writing high fantasy in novels that are quite prolific.
So back in the day, when I first started writing, I would definitely have way more revisions, because and this is the advice that I give anybody who's writing for the first couple books, is just finish the damn book. Like, don't revise as you write, because you will get lost in that until you know kind of what you're doing. And so back when I first started writing, I would always have like the first level of edits was revisions, where you get an editorial letter back and usually a phone call. And there'd be like really minor edits in that part. It'd just be things the editor just like really dumb typos, right? That the editor's like, I'm going to mark this because it's so glaring. And then usually you move on to actual edits at that point. But as I've done it more and more, I've learned to be able to revise as I write. And you don't have to do it that way. It's just something I just don't suggest when you're first starting out, because it also becomes a procrastination tool. And it can be like, it's its own form of performance anxiety, because if you never move past that beginning, you don't have to worry about, can I finish this book? But now I do revise as I write. And like now, if I know something's not working, I cannot move forward until I fix that. So I usually don't have revisions now. That's not to say that won't ever happen again. I'm sure it will. But then I move into edits, and because we do work on a rather tight production schedule, edits almost always contain line edits at the same time. And that's when your manuscript looks like a damn Christmas tree, where it's just mark changes on. It's so hard to look at because there's things marked out, new stuff, there's comments in the little side. And I learned that Microsoft Word really does not handle scrolling well once you get to a certain page and word count. It is a pain. And then it's like some of the comments are just like smiley faces or like personal notes. And so you're trying to find like, okay, what do I have to do? And then usually at that point, it goes into copy editing. And that is where they're double, triple checking that you're not contradicting anything. And that is also where I feel like the most irritation comes, because it will just sometimes you just that's because you have to be so like anal retentive. You have to be, because again, there could just be one little thing that as the writer, you're like, it's not a big deal, but because you know the story, right? That's why. But as somebody who's like, yeah, no, this actually doesn't mean this, like, or whatever. And so at that point, it goes into proofing. And proofing is like the last hurrah. Like usually it's typeset at that point. And what that means, it looks like a book. It's formatted as a book. They really do not want you making substantial changes at that moment, because then they have to retypeset. So any just like word changes is what you'd be doing. But yeah, it's usually once you're in between line edits and copy edits is where like I find it to be the most stressful, because you're just going to that's also where you get those you used crushed 3 times in this chapter, and then you're like, well, I could go find smash, and that just reads dumb. For me in this situation. So it's a lot of that, like what you're doing.
I think your piece of advice, though, for especially like authors early on in their career to just like finish the book is so important, because one of my favorite sayings is you can't edit a blank page.
Yes.
So like just like get the book done and then go back and you'll be fine.
I heard the more inappropriate version of that, which is my favorite, which is you can't fix shit. Like you can't, if it's nothing, no, I'm sorry. The saying is you can fix shit, you can't fix a blank page. And I don't know who said that. I think I do. I don't want to say who it is. It is a very well-esteemed author who said it. I really think it was that one who said it. And I was like, oh, but they had a point, and it's true. You can fix, and also as a new writer, or even as a seasoned writer, understand you will write a book that is terrible. The first draft is terrible, but it has good bones, right? You just need help putting those bones in order. But if you get so caught up in that, you don't ever finish that book. And so that's something that I just really hope newer writers kind of understand. Like, don't worry about it being perfect. Get it finished first.
I wanted to talk a little bit about the Blood and Ash series, because you've now expanded to have the Flesh and Fire series as well, which is set in the same world. What made you want to expand and tell more stories within that universe?
So when I was writing the main series, Blood and Ash, I was in between writing the second and third book, where I knew it was going to be getting more into the history of those kingdoms, and also kind of revealing more of the truth than what you had previously known. And I started writing that out. And I realized, like, as I was writing it out, that telling it, you lose a lot of the emotion behind it. You lose a lot of the sacrifice, the excitement, when it just becomes a history lesson. And that is where I really realized that I think I can tell this story. And so that's where A Shadow in the Ember, the first book in the Flesh and Fire, spun out of, was really in between A Kingdom and The Crown of Gilded Bones. So book 2 and book 3. And then I knew at that point that I wanted that Flesh and Fire series to end at a certain point and in between 2 of the main series books, because there were certain things that you were learning in the Flesh and Fire world that when you would go back and read Blood and Ash, you're like, oh crap. Like, or they're like Easter eggs again dropped. I would recommend if you think you're going to have a prequel, it's a lot easier to write that before you write the damn main series, because that's not easy. Like, because you're dealing with the same world, but two different timelines. And then not only that, you're dealing with, okay, wait a minute. The people in this book know this series know this, but they wouldn't know this in the other series yet. And trying to remember who knows what. And again, a huge thanks to my editor, because the amount of emails I send them, like, I think I'm right, but this would not be this way, right? Like, because, you don't always have the time to go back and read your books that you've written, where you have to get writing. But yeah, I would recommend, if you have a hint that you will be doing a prequel, do the prequel first. And don't even call it a prequel. Make that the first series.
I'm so curious because you write in series, but you also kind of let the story come to you as you write a book. Do you know how long a series is going to be when you start out? And does that change throughout the writing process?
Oh, yeah, it changes every time. And you would think, because I know that, I would keep my mouth shut and not tell people how many books are in the series. But no, I do it every series. And every series, I'm incorrect. I usually start, because also a lot of it's book contracts, right? It's 3 books, or sometimes 2 books, but usually it's 3. And because they don't want to agree to like more than that before they know that they're going to want to get that involved. But usually with certain books, it's like, I really don't know until I finish the first book, right? I think I know, yet I know better. And I should know to wait until I get to the end of the second book. Because if you're not where you need to be in that series for the third book to truly be the final book, it's going to be more than 3 books. And at least for me, I never really know that until I'm towards the end of that second book. And it would just be better if I did not tell people how many books. But yeah, it's changed. I've actually had it go down in books before, like where I thought it would be 5 books, but it turned out to be 4. Because I do think you have to find that middle ground between giving a story enough time on the page that justifies another book, and then not dragging it out just to have another book. And that can be sometimes a very hard line to walk, because you might think that it's only going to be 3 books. Like Flesh and Fire series, it was only supposed to be 3. I believed it would only be 3. I got to writing the final book and readers were like, oh my God, this book's going to be so big because you're going to have to do all this and that. And I'm like, yeah, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it. And then I got halfway through and it's like, I'm not doing it. It's going to not work. And I had to have a phone call with my editor. And I was like, you have 2 options here. Either this book's going to be like 400,000 words, or we're going to have another book. And of course they were like, yeah, another book, because they don't even want to know how much money that book costs to make at that page count. So yeah, that can happen. And so advice to writers, keep your mouth shut. Don't be like me.
I'm just imagining how heavy a 400,000 word book would be.
Oh gosh. Well, Born of Blood and Ash is over 300,000 words.
Wow.
That's the one sitting, you guys can't see it, obviously the podcast, but they can. It sits behind me. It is heavy. When those books showed up in boxes, it was insane. Like, it was like, nobody wants to move that. Like, nobody wants to pick up that box. But yeah, that is the longest book I wrote in
so far.
So far. Hopefully ever.
God, that's so big. I want to switch gears just a little bit, because I know we've been chatting for a while. And I really want to talk to you about the online popularity that your books have received, because I'm sure it's no secret to anybody listening that your series gained a little bit of traction on TikTok. Mm-hmm. And I'm really curious what it's like to have that amount of conversation around your book, and if it's ever a little bit overwhelming dealing with that much feedback from fans.
I feel like, so whenever you talk about what makes a book viral or successful, it really depends on what someone's idea of success is, right? Because I've been lucky throughout my career where I'll have book series that do really well. And you're very ecstatic and you're like, oh my God, like when you have books that get translated into multiple countries, like you're just like, it's big. That's what you know. And you're like, that's great. But then you do have a series that goes viral, and that's a different beast. It's a good beast, but it is different. And I remember like, so again, I always say this, like people, when it comes to what makes a book, quote unquote, successful, I've always said part of it is the writing, the marketing, and then the rest of it is luck, is a mixture of things, timing, the right person picked it up and then shared it. And with the Blood and Ash series, it came out March 2020. And we know what happened, at least in the US and many other countries on the Western side here, of what was going on in the world. And at the same time, book talk was taking off, and more people were home looking for something to pass time. And it was a combination of that stuff. And I remember I knew it was going big on book talk, but I wasn't on TikTok. So I really wasn't paying attention to that. Like people would, and I remember when people who are in my normal life, like are not a part of writing, like would DM me on like Facebook or something, be like, oh, I saw this TikTok. And I'm like, okay. Like, and it'd just be like, it would be weird because it'd be like, this person's really not that, they're not a reader, and it's showing up on their For You pages somehow. And I remember looking at like, and I don't even know if you can do this. I feel like people are complaining that you couldn't do this, or something happened for a while you couldn't, where you can look at how many views a hashtag has. And I remember like the first time it was an insane amount. Like it was 50, 60 million. And that was an insane amount. Like that was just, for me, that was an insane amount. But the thing is with it though, like with the good comes the not so great. But I am somebody who even good stuff can get in my head, because when, for example, if someone is like, they really like a character, or they really, and I know, well, I'm about to break your heart, like, kind of thing, where, or they want something to happen. They love the series, but they really want something to happen. And it's not, it can get in your head. And even the good stuff can get into your head. And I'm sure that there are people out there who can just not let that happen, but I can. And honestly, the stuff that gets in my head more than anything is the good stuff. It's the expectation more than anything, because after you write so many books, you learn that your book is not going to be for everyone. And you learn that what one person loves, the next person hates. And ultimately, you have to write for yourself, because you cannot write for anybody else, because you're never going to succeed at that, because for every person who wants it, another person doesn't. And the expectation, though, is, I think, is the pressure. But I feel like that is a pressure that you see in many careers, where people expect, and it's not a bad thing, but it messes with your head. So I learned that I could not let myself like really know, because, and I interact with readers a lot, in environments where we can make sure that like I can also easily kind of walk away from if I need to focus type of situation. But, and also at the same time, I think that it's good to interact with readers. And again, I have a reader group, but we should also be careful of reader spaces. And once authors get involved highly into reader spaces, we've seen historically, it almost becomes like a bit of a downfall of that, because not great things come from that sometimes. And then also, but as a reader, you may not be comfortable being honest about how a book made you feel, knowing that that author could end up watching that. Or maybe that is what you want, is you want the author to know. But at the end, it never works out well. Like things just don't work out. So I always think of book talk, it's for readers. It's not for authors. And I like to have that left alone, because truly that is the word of mouth that you cannot replicate, and you can't buy that. And so, but also it's just, they should have their own space. And So I like to kind of, I always say it's not my sandbox. So
You mentioned that book talk is kind of that reader space and that new word of mouth. How do you work on your end to kind of keep that momentum going?
I feel like that, my gosh, that's like the question of the age, right? Because you never really know if you're keeping that momentum going. Like you don't know. And I think because I am active in my reader group, now my reader group has nowhere near the amount of the readers of this series, but and it even took me a long time to realize that there are so many readers. And I think this is something that we all as authors forget, and people online in general. Those who are online are just a drop in the bucket of the actual reading market and the ones who are reading the books. And they are not really keeping up with you day to day. They're not like, they may go on to see if you have a new book out. They may say, oh, this book's coming out next year and mark whatever they do to track it. But that's it, right? They're going about their life. They're reading other books. And so you really don't know how to keep the momentum going with them. I think what helps in some situations is where you do have less time in between releases than traditionally, but that's not always possible. I mean, it hasn't been for me because I feel like with fantasy, the more you get into a series, the longer it takes to write that book because you're the fourth, fifth book into a world you've created. And it just takes more time to work on. And where I was writing a book in 2 months, I'm now writing a book in 6 months. So you have that issue. But I mean, I feel like the only thing you can really focus on when you're writing is keeping your head down and writing. And then when you can pop your head out, kind of paying attention to what type of marketing is working and hope it doesn't change by the time your book comes out. Because what works for one book does not mean it's going to work for another one. But I feel like you almost have to let it go a little bit in the beginning when you're writing because, it's because again, as we've said, like by the time that book comes out, there could be book talk could not really be the place anymore, right? It could be something else and you just don't know.
We've talked to a lot of authors before who have said the best thing to sell, like book one, is the next book and just keep writing. And I think that's so true. Like you said, just kind of keeping your head down and writing is the best way too.
Like fantasy has what we call like a long tailwind. Like normally, like most genres, it's 6 months to a year and then that's it. Like it's being remaindered. The stock's remaindered, or it doesn't. If you're hardcover, you may not even get a paperback release to give that series that additional oomph. But fantasy and certain subgenres do have a long tailwind where, you could see the pickup on book 3. Like we always say, not book 3. We always say like after your first book, it's the second book for the most organic sales pickup. And then the final book is like you have the 3 chances, first, second, and final, where you have the most organic reach for sales. You could all you can do is write that book and then it's in God's hands or whomever's hands at that point. It's real motivating, isn't it?
No, it's so true. It all always just comes back to the writing.
Yeah.
And we've kept you for a while now, but I wanted you to give you a chance to tell our listeners what you're working on next and where they can find you online.
So right now I am working on I think it's the 5th book in the Blood and Ash series. And it is the last book with Poppy as the kind of, main person in it. And usually you can find me in the Facebook group Jlanders, which is just like JLA, like Justice League of America, Anders.com. And I post teasers in there. So like of the books I'm writing on, so people can see little hints. And sometimes I will share things that, may actually answer long wanted to know questions, but have, never been like an actual big spoiler for me. But usually you can interact with me in there.
Amazing. Well, we will include links to your Facebook group in our show notes and links to your books, of course. But Jennifer, thank you so much for chatting with us today and about all things publishing.
Thank you.
Thank you guys so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Kobo Writing Life podcast. If you're interested in picking up Jennifer's books, we will include links in our show notes. If you're enjoying this podcast, please be sure to rate, review, and subscribe. And if you're looking for more tips on growing your self-publishing business, you can find us at kobowritinglife.com. Be sure to follow us on social media. We are at Kobo Writing Life on Facebook and Twitter, and at kobo.writing.life on Instagram and Threads.
This episode was hosted by Laura Granger and Rachel Wharton, with production by Terrence Abrahams. Editing is provided by Kelly Robotham. Our theme music is composed by Tearjerker, and a huge thanks to Jennifer L. Armentrout for being our guest. If you're ready to start your publishing journey, sign up today at kobo.com/writinglife. Until next time, happy writing.